Okay, so today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be looking at images, finding an image, and then turning it into a seamless texture. So we're going to use a stone texture to actually accomplish that. So basically the way we're going to go about that is we're going to go to Google Images and we'll just search stone wall texture. And it'll comes up with a whole bunch of different options. You can add seamless to the end of that, and if you add seamless to the end, a lot of these are what they call themselves seamless, where they'll tile next to each other and you won't actually see the line between one and the other. If there's a seamless texture out there of the stone that you're looking for, fantastic, go ahead and use it. But a lot of times what you're looking for does not have a seamless texture, so we have to create one ourselves. Or you'll end up with a seamless texture that isn't a very big swatch, and you'll see the same stones over and over and over again. So what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and let's scroll down here and see if we can't find one that's kind of interesting and might work pretty well for us. So let's see. We also want to make sure that we get one that's going to be a high enough resolution. So right here, so this is a decent one here. We'll try this one. 3000 by 2000, that's a pretty good resolution for the image. It's got a lot going on with it and would be pretty complicated and pretty difficult to make into a seamless texture. So we'll go ahead and right click save as. We'll save it to the desktop and hit save. So then we're going to go ahead and open it up in Photoshop. You guys can all laugh at my Adobe Photoshop CS3. It's really, really old, but it does everything that I need it to do. So we'll go in and we'll find our image. There it is. And we'll open that up. And so basically what I'm going to do is because this is a big enough image, I'm going to double click on my background and make it into a layer, and then I'm going to make it about a quarter of the size of what it was. And the reason I do that is because now I've got some room to operate around it, and I can duplicate this layer and see how it's going to work top, bottom, left, right. So how is this this image going to tile itself around? So I might also be able to get away, if I'm lucky, with just doing something as simple as this, flipping it horizontal and butterflying the image, and then taking both of those, merging those, and then duplicating that down, and maybe you can get away with flipping it that direction as well. That's going to look terrible, and also all of your shadows on the bottom side aren't going to work. This is why stone textures can be really tricky, because you need the shadows to all work the direction that you want, and most of the time this butterfly effect doesn't work for them. So we're going to go ahead and undo all of that and start getting into how do we deal with something like this. So first things first, what we want to do is I'm going to flip this horizontally and place this next to it, so that way basically what's going to happen, actually let's go ahead and flip that back. Here's what we're going to do. We'll start with something like this, and this way if it tiles, what's going to happen is this is going to come next to that, and that actually looks halfway decent. It's not amazing, but it's not calling itself out as something absolutely atrocious and an immediate red flag of, hey, this is going to be an issue and we're going to see this over and over again, and it's going to be a huge red flag that this image is tiling all over the place. So that we can almost live with. We might clean it up a little bit, but for the most part that should work okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to overlay this one, and then I'm going to take this eraser, and what I like to use is actually, if you come down to natural brushes, I like to use one of these two down here. They're not perfectly round. They kind of have a little bit rougher edges, so when you erase stuff it doesn't call itself out quite so obscenely. But then I'm going to make the opacity something like a 75%, and I'm going to start erasing and kind of blending one into the next. So if I can start to find edges of stones and just kind of work my way around, so that way I can find a way to kind of blend these things together, and not call out so much difference from one side to the next. So that's starting to look halfway decent. Maybe I go somewhere in there. So now it doesn't look quite so bad. The one issue that we're going to end up with are this stone, this stone, this stone down here that's mirroring, and then this big one you're going to see over and over again. So what I'm going to do is actually come in here and find kind of a stone that's kind of blending into the background pretty well and not jumping out. So these red ones jump out pretty well, but a lot of these are all kind of similar colors, different shapes. This one seems to be kind of a different shape, but also is blending in pretty well, has a little bit of the color of everything else. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this one, copy that, and pull it up to the top. And then I'm going to take this stone and I'm actually going to place it over top of this one over here. So I'm going to transform it, rotate it around, kind of move things into place. Maybe I pull it down this way a little bit and kind of get rid of that stone that was there. And play with it like that. So that sits in place okay. Now I can come in with my brush, maybe I drop it down in pixel size quite a bit, and also drop my opacity down to like 15%, and I just kind of rapid click feather the edges, so that way I don't get a really harsh sort of edge where I copied that into place. So if I can blend those edges together, so like this is a perfect example, I get that harsh line there, but as I kind of feather it a little bit, that all starts to kind of fade away and starts to work pretty well. There we go. Okay, so now that stone isn't mirrored across there. We're not seeing that quite so much. These are mirroring, but we might get rid of them, we might not. It depends on when we test this out how egregious those sort of are. So we need to get rid of this stone and this stone. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of those, copying some other things around, and then I'll show you kind of where we go from there. Okay, so here's what I've got. Basically what I did is I went in and I created a version of this that can then be tiled next to itself, but vertically that's really difficult to do. Like I said, if I mirror this across, now my shadows are all goofy. So what I've done is I actually copied this bottom layer, I copied this up and I flipped it. And the reason I flipped it is because I don't want this stone over here to be stacking over and over again. I don't want to see this stone stacking over and over again, one after the other. So basically I flipped it across, so now this stone is over here, this one's over here. It doesn't look quite so tiled as it did before. But then what I've done is I've gone in and I've kind of erased strategically around the different stones. So then as this starts to drop in here, now it kind of all starts to line up, and there's a certain spot kind of right in there where it all starts to work fairly well together. I could bring it down a little bit further and maybe find a different spot, but for me that works pretty well. You're not seeing a harsh line going across there. So then from there I just copy this image up and then flip it again. So now this stone is stacking all the way up here and not halfway down. So this isn't as noticeable as boom, 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 boom over and over again. And I give myself a nice tall texture to work with. If I think I'm gonna at some point have a stone wall that is taller than this, I might go a little bit taller with my texture, but for the most part this seems like a pretty good size swatch to have, because I know that I'm going to see a line, a distinct line, whenever this sits on top of that, because I can't get this to kind of undulate back and forth and butterfly across, because I would have to flip this vertically, and that wouldn't work out real well for shadow wise. So now that I have this figured out and situated, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to merge all of these together, and I'm going to go ahead and crop this exactly like this. So one thing I would caution is zoom way in and make sure, absolutely certain, that the very edge of your texture doesn't have a little bit of white, because if you have a little bit of white on one side or the other, you're going to see that white line over and over again as it tiles next to itself. Okay, so now that we have our texture here, I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'll go ahead and save this as test material. And then to create the bump map for this one, hopefully this works pretty well. We've got some darker spots in the grout, but we also have a lot of varying colored stone, which could make this difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just desaturate the entire thing. And this seems to work okay, but my grout is very similar in color to a lot of my stone, so I could come in here and adjust the brightness contrast. Maybe I increase the brightness and up the contrast by a whole bunch. The more contrast I get, the more kind of bump and texture that it's going to give me. So I'll go with something like, maybe something in there would work all right. So if this texture weren't to work really well for the bump purposes, unfortunately the only way to really improve it is to come in here and start, and this takes quite a bit of time, but once you have a texture, you have a texture. Taking the black and just making the black the grout. So you just kind of start to fill in as much as you possibly can with the grout joints, so that way it knows what is stone and what is grout, and it's going to set that darker portion back from all of the other stuff. This takes absolutely forever, especially with a texture this big, but if it's something that you're going to use over and over again, then it works and you'll have that texture quite a bit. But I will say that stone is the only one that I've really encountered that I've had to do this for, and it's the only one. Well, I've had to do it for something like a chain link fence or something like that, but it's pretty easy to find just a black and white chain link fence image that doesn't have the texture to it. So those kinds of things are more readily easily found, whereas this, you're kind of on your own creating something that's going to look the way you want. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that, and then I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we'll save this as test material, and I always use _bump as my default kind of naming convention, and we'll close this out, and we'll go ahead and open up Revit. So once we're into Revit, basically we're going to create a new material. We'll go ahead and create like an 8-inch generic wall. That way that gives us a little something to test render this on, and something we can see kind of how it tiles and how it's working for us. But we'll go ahead and create a new architectural template. Okay. And then as this opens up, we'll go ahead and create an 8-inch wall. And I'm actually going to create another wall this direction. And the reason for that is in my 3D view, when I go to render this, I'm going to want to see some shadow on it, and see how it bends the corner. Because if you see this all in perfect sunlight, that's going to read flat no matter how good the bump map is on it. So we want to give ourselves a little bit of shadow. So if I turn shadows on, we can kind of see how the shadow line's going to work there, and we can kind of orbit around and maybe get the shadow to give us a little bit more. So that should work right there. Let's go ahead and make these, and we don't necessarily need them 20 feet tall. Maybe we do 15 foot. That should work. We'll zoom in a little bit here, and we'll grab our walls, edit type, edit structure, apply a material, and we'll create new material, name it stone. And then under appearance, we'll browse and find our material here. So I've got my test material. Now we need to figure out how big this is. So we know the height of it is pretty substantial because I copied it over and over. So we'll say this is like a 20 foot, 5 foot tall sample, and maybe width-wise we're 12 feet, something like that. And then we'll use this to determine whether that's fairly accurate. So we'll use the walls option. Okay, so you'll see it's got this line right here. That's because it's showing you how it's tiling vertically. It's not necessarily going to do that over here. It's just showing you, how is this going to work together. Okay, so these stones seem to be, these might be a little too big. These are a little small, so let's go ahead and say, it seems like the proportions are okay, so maybe this is only a 20 foot tall sample there. So that should work pretty well. We've got tiling on, that'll work. And then we'll apply our bump map. So our bump map is there. We want to double check, so we've got 9 foot 7 1/4 and 20 feet. So we'll say 9 foot 7 1/4 by 20 feet. We'll say okay. And now we can start to play with this a little bit and drag this slider up and down to see how the bump is going to work for us. So maybe we end up in the kind of 700s. That's getting a little bit better. It's not, you're not going to get, a big, huge rounded stone unless you go in and actually really mess with your bump map and start adding shadowing and all of that sort of stuff. So if we say okay, okay. So now we've got a stone texture. It looks crazy here, but when we render it, it's not going to look near as kind of pixelated and everything. So I'm going to render this on medium, and exterior sun, I don't care to render anything other than just a white background, and we'll say render. I test render on medium. My machine renders fairly quickly, so a medium rendering doesn't usually take too long. So there's a completed rendering of our image. That's actually pretty good. That's actually not too bad. So we're not seeing, you're seeing this tiling a little bit there and there. If you got windows and stuff breaking this up, that actually wouldn't be too bad. So we've got a decent bump map. The bump seems to have worked all right. If we're actually fairly close to this, if this were a building, we'd be sitting back a little ways, so you wouldn't be right on top of it. So overall, I'm fairly happy with that. I might mess with it a little bit more, adjust the contrast of the bump map a touch, play with it a little bit, but then once I get it, my final rendered image into Photoshop, I might mess with it a little bit there and increase contrast and stuff like that to really bring out the shadow and the lighter spots in the stone. So overall, that's not too bad as far as creating a seamless stone texture along with the bump map that goes with it. So beyond that, I mentioned we're going to discuss doing something with a single texture to it. So let's say we're going to do an area rug, which is a good example of this. So we'll go in here and we'll say we'll just create a floor, okay, create an extrusion, and let's say we're going to make an 8x10 area rug. So something like that. And I'm going to make this an 1/8 inch thick. and we'll apply a material to it. So we'll create a new material, rename it, call it rug. So now for this, I'm going to go in, and I actually have texture folder, and I believe I have them under miscellaneous. So I've got some miscellaneous kind of rugs in here. Let's say we grab something like this one. So we know we're going to be creating an 8x10, and you can already tell from this image this does not tile well. You're seeing exactly where that drops out. So I know the width is going to be 8 foot. I know the height is going to be 10 foot. Now, if I make this exactly 8 foot by 10 foot, I need this to be exactly on the money, no fluff whatsoever when it comes to how this texture sits on my surface. I want to actually give myself a little bit of a buffer there. I don't want to have to hit it on the money, so I'm going to give myself like a 1/2 inch of buffer there. So 10 foot and a 1/2 inch, 8 foot and a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to leave it as tiled. The only reason I leave it as tiled is so that I can kind of find it. Sometimes if you throw it on none, you end up with a big gray blob and you're not real sure where your image is located within the ether of space. But if you have it tiled, you can use these positional options to kind of look at it. So we'll take our glossiness down. We'll say OK. I'm going to finish that, and we'll go ahead and finish the model. And I'm going to come down here in my plan view and hit realistic. So as you can see, my texture isn't aligned exactly where I want it to be. So I'm going to come into materials and appearance, and then I'm going to come down here to edit image, and let's pull this in a little bit, that way I can see the edge here. So in the X direction, back and forth this way, if I move it this direction, say like 1.5 feet, we'll see where that puts us. And we'll hit apply. So I need a little bit more, maybe we go 1.9 feet. Not quite. We'll say 11. Okay, so it looks like I'm not getting that really dark line over here just yet. So I'm within that 1/2 inch kind of fluff zone that I've got. So that helps me there. I do have a line this direction as well. So let's say I move this down, we'll say 4 feet, and see where we stand. Okay, so it jumped all the way up to here, so we'll go ahead and say it's 3 foot, like we'll say 3.9, and we'll see where that lands us. So a little bit more, we'll say 8. That's getting pretty close. Maybe it's in the 7.5 range to be perfect. So using this positional tool to kind of move things up and down and adjust it back and forth to get it so that you have your texture exactly where you want it on the surface. That's how I operate when I'm doing things like area rugs and stuff like that. So as far as surfaces with a single texture on them, that's a good way to go about doing them. So if you have any questions or issues with materials, or maybe a video that you'd like me to do, just let me know, and hopefully I can churn that out here fairly quickly. So that's a quick run through of creating materials and things in Photoshop, and then bringing them into Revit, as well as just kind of single use textures.